the inaugural episode of GCUC Radio. I'm your host, Tony Bacigalupo. Now, this podcast is going to be primarily based around a series of conversations I've recorded with some of the movement's best organizers and key experts in related fields. In the course of this podcast, you're going to hear the stories of people who have built amazing communities against all odds, and the perspectives of people who know what's happening on the grander scale. If you're organizing a co-working community, you'll be certain to get all sorts of helpful tips and inspiring ideas. But I'd like for us to go just one step further. As we go through this series, I'd like to challenge you to join me in wondering, how might we, people who are involved in this world of co-working in one way or another, use this new co-working movement to shift our world for the better? How might we use these new paradigms as delivery vehicles for better ways of relating, of doing business, and of living our lives? For this first episode, however, I'd like to set the stage for the context around all of this. We'll look at the origins of co-working as a movement and as an industry, my own story of how I first discovered co-working, and then a bit about how the Global Co-working Unconference Conference came to be. Finally, we'll look at where GCUC and the co-working movement as a whole are headed from here. All this and more coming up on this, the first episode of GCUC Radio. So first off, a little bit of history about co-working itself. Co-working is a phenomenon that is taking the world by storm. From one community in 2005 in San Francisco to 7,800 as of 2015, and in 2016 alone, another 3,000 or so new ones coming on board. So how did all this come about in the first place? And what implications does it have on work as we know it? Well, let's hop in the time machine first, all the way back to 2005, when a guy named Brad Newberg started the first co-working community out of a wellness center in San Francisco. Now, he started something very simple and really did it just for his own purposes. He wanted to be able to get out of the house, work alongside other people, and have a sense of structure to his day that he could enforce by being around other folks who were wanting the same thing. But what happened was he ran into some folks who themselves wanted the same thing, but also saw the potential in co-working to be something that could be much bigger. They were champions of the open source movement. Their names were Chris Messina and Tara Hunt, and they were folks who were very active in the scene in San Francisco at a time when open source was a big deal. They were starting things like bar camps, which were very popular unconferences at the time. Chris invented the hashtag, which was such a democratizing way to bring people around these kinds of conversations. And they saw in co-working an opportunity to galvanize a global movement. And so what they did was they started things like a wiki and a WordPress blog and a Google group. And these are all things that still exist today, and you can find them if you go to coworking.com. And they're all administered by a number of different people all over the world, and no one person in particular owns them. And they made it really easy for other people to take this co-working idea and make it their own. And what happened was people started to do it. People started to find this co-working idea, realize it overlapped with other things that they were thinking about in their own areas, and they started joining the conversation and sharing their own ideas. One thing led to another, and eventually this became a global movement. More and more people started using this word to describe what they were working on in their own homes and in their own cities. And before you knew it, co-working started becoming a household name. Now, what happened along the way is that two things started to emerge: the movement of co-working and the industry of co-working. The movement is essentially these people talking about this co-working idea in every form that it takes, commercial and non-commercial. The industry side focuses on the actual business around co-working, which generally focuses on office space and workspace and the different ways that you can make money sharing workspace in new ways. And so both of these things are growing. In the course of this podcast, we'll look at co-working from both perspectives and, wherever possible, the intriguing intersection between the two. Now, as for me, I had a very interesting story, and it's really characteristic of the story that so many other people have had when it comes to how they first discovered co-working and how they got involved. I graduated from college in 2005 with a degree in computer science, and after doing so, I started working from home for a web development firm based on Long Island where I grew up. Working from home was great until it started to drive me crazy. I had to get out of the house and I had to be around other people. But how? This was something I talked over with my parents, and we devised this idea for a space that would sit somewhere between the traditional office and the local cafe, providing better working services, but in a more casual and comfortable setting. After a little bit of Googling, I discovered that others had already had this idea, and there was even a name for it: co-working. In New York City, the only co-working community I could find was one called Jelly, which was a casual gathering of people at a loft apartment called House 2.0 in Midtown, taking place every other Thursday. I was immediately enamored with the idea, so I signed up and attended my first Jelly on March 14th of 2007. And on that day, I was exposed for the first time to a world of people who worked for themselves. They all had their own businesses in one way or another, and so I actually felt like a bit of an outcast, being the only one there who was a salaried employee. The fellow Jelliers, however, were more than welcoming to me and to anyone else who came by. And so needless to say, I was hooked. I attended every Jelly I could, eventually moved into that loft apartment, and started getting involved in the early efforts to develop what would become Manhattan's first dedicated co-working space. That led to the opening of Newark City in November 2008, a co-working space that I put my heart and soul into right up until we closed it in the summer of 2015. Now, I could spend a lot of time telling you stories about every step of that journey, but that's for another time. Now, as for Juicy, in early 2008, I met up with two guys who were traveling the country doing research for a book they were going to write, which would become the first book anyone had written about co-working. Drew Jones and Todd Sunstead quickly became close friends of mine after a long conversation in the cafe that we were using as a de facto co-working space when, believe it or not, Manhattan still didn't have a dedicated co-working space of its own. They insisted I join them later that spring on a trip to South by Southwest in March, offering me a place to stay. Well, I couldn't resist. I was on my way. That year, a woman who was developing a co-working space in Austin at the time, Julie Gamal, organized a meetup of people who were into co-working at the Hotel San Jose. In attendance were a couple dozen people from around the world who were all either involved in co-working spaces or were wanting to be. It was the first time for me when I realized that I was part of something truly global and that this was going to be big. In the following 2 years, the meetups happening in Austin around South by Southwest continued to grow. At the same time, conversations on the global co-working Google group started to percolate around the development of a formal co-working conference. I suggested that since so many of us were already going to South by Southwest every year anyway, why not hold the conference the day before South by so that all we'd have to do is fly in a day earlier? I had a selfish reason for doing this, which was that I was broke, and so saving money on an extra flight and more hotel time was going to be really attractive for me, and I think that made it a lot more accessible to others as well. Well, my friends at Loose Cubes, a startup that was based out of my co-working space at the time, thought that was a pretty good idea, so they picked up the ball and ran with it. What resulted was the 2011 Co-working Unconference at the Hangar Lounge in Austin, Texas. Since they were based in New York, the Loose Cubes team enlisted the help of a local Austin co-working space owner by the name of Liz Elam, the proprietor of Link Co-working. In the subsequent years to come, Liz stepped up to take the lead on ensuring that these conferences continued, starting with 2012's first Global Co-working Unconference Conference, GCUC. Juicy. Eh? Fast forward to today, Juicy is not only happening in a different US city every year, it's now grown to a global enterprise. There are Juicy conferences taking place now in 5 regions, with events coming up in Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, Beijing, Melbourne, and Montreal, all in 2016 alone. where does it all go from here? What's the future of GCUC and of co-working, and really the way that we work as we know it? This is something that we're going to be exploring in the course of this podcast. My hope is that all of this is leading us toward a more enlightened relationship with our work. I grew up seeing a lot of people miserable in their jobs, trading their lives away for the security of a paycheck. The new relationships with work that we're seeing emerging now provide a lot of promise, but there are big trade-offs as well. If the growth of co-working spaces means we have a chance to replace the hierarchies of traditional employment with peer-to-peer network systems, then maybe people can have a relationship with work that's so much more than just a paycheck. Maybe people can better connect their work with their passions in a way that supports them having healthy relationships with their families, their neighbors, and themselves. Maybe in this century we'll have a chance to shift our relationship with work from one that's viewed as a necessary drudgery done for someone else to an exciting opportunity to realize one's potential. There's no shortage of work to be done. The nature of the work that faces us as a race in the decades ahead is going to require more than just showing up. It's going to require our complete creative faculties and our hearts and our souls. Co-working is providing a path to a way of approaching work that supports that. If you're listening to this podcast and you've made it all the way to the end of this episode especially, then you're a part of shaping how that goes. Is co-working going to be a transformative force in shifting the world's relationship with work for the better? Or is it simply going to be a slightly different way to rent office space? I know which one I'm betting on, but in reality it comes down to you. You get to shape where this movement goes. On this podcast, I'll be talking to people who are uncompromising in their vision for where they see co-working and by extension our societies going. Join me and let's see where we can go together. So that's it for our first episode. I'd love to hear your honest feedback, so shoot me your thoughts by emailing me at tony@nwc.co or on Twitter at @TonyBeGood. That's TonyBgoode. To learn much more about and to purchase tickets for the upcoming GCUC South America Conference on March 3rd and 4th in Sao Paulo and in Los Angeles from May 3rd to 6th, head to GCUC.co, that's GCUC.co. For GCUC Radio, I'm Tony Bacigalupo signing off. Vive la co-working!